When you and I come to the events of Easter, we don't come to fairy tales, we don't come to myths, we don't come to legends that are designed to give us a warm feeling that are ultimately empty and meaningless. No, when we come to the events of Easter, we come to real events of history and events which therefore are filled with substance and significance, even with power.
Welcome to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths. I'm Steve Hiller, and glad you've joined us today as we continue our series, The Darkness Before the Dawn, continuing, Jonathan, to look at the resurrection. And why does it matter that the resurrection of Jesus is a historical event?
Well, I mean, it's a lovely story, and it's a heartwarming idea that the Jesus who died is the Jesus who rose. But if it's merely a myth or a legend, but not history, we have no confidence that he actually achieved anything for us. I mean, if Jesus only rose in myth and legend, but not in reality, you and I have no hope for life beyond the grave. But the Christian claim is that Jesus rose bodily and truly, and that means that he can give life to you and to me beyond the grave.
Well, let's continue to look at this from the book of Mark. We're in chapter 16, the first 8 verses. Our message is called A Day of Victory. Here is Jonathan.
Well, friends, we know that in this present world there are plenty of days of darkness, days of defeat, days of death, even days of despair. We know those days all too well. We are all too familiar with them. But Resurrection Sunday is the day of supreme light, the day of hope, the day of promise, the day of victory. And as we say that and as we declare that, we need to be clear together that this is not a day of joy simply because we sort of stir ourselves up and try to create a certain type of atmosphere, a particular type of experience that might sort of distract us from all our troubles and sorrows for one solitary day within the year. I don't know if you noticed that the Disney Corporation is in the news quite a lot at the moment. Perhaps you saw the headlines. They caught my eye this weekend. It seems that there is some trouble brewing in the Magic Kingdom. Some of us will have had the happy experience or perhaps the miserable experience if you dislike crowds and noise and so on, but the experience, nonetheless, of visiting one of the famed Disney parks. The corporate marketers at Disney refer to the parks as the happiest place on earth, and every day there is meant to be a magical celebration. There is ice cream, and there is candy floss, and there is Mickey Mouse, and there are parades, and there are fireworks every day, without fail, 365 days a year. Just imagine working there and enduring that on repeat. It's all very creative, of course. It's all very clever, but it is at the same time an illusion. It is a grand piece of theater. It is a mirage of happiness, but not really happiness in any lasting or sustainable sense. Now, I guess that we could come here today with a degree of skepticism about the celebration of Easter Sunday. Maybe you yourself have come here today with a good dose of skepticism. Is there really anything ultimately to celebrate? Or is this just a piece of religious theater? A good show to momentarily cheer the soul and lift the spirits? Is this merely a happy distraction from the reality of the everyday grind and the sorrows of the real world? Well, here at the end of his gospel, at the end of his account of the life and ministry of Jesus, at the end of his account of the saving work of Jesus Christ, Mark takes us now to this day in history. He takes us to Resurrection Sunday, and he shows us that this is a day of light, and a day of joy, and a day of hope. And he shows us why this is indeed a day of victory, a day for real rejoicing. He shows us in particular that the resurrection, it is a historical event, it is a divine event, and it is a life-transforming event. And we're going to think about each of those in turn. First, the resurrection, it is a historical event, Mark wants to tell us. Now, let me just underline that. Let me take a moment to emphasize that, to allow it to settle into our thinking. According to the Bible, according to Mark here, the resurrection is not a fairy tale. It is not a myth. It is not a legend. It is not merely a comforting story. No, it is a fact of history. This is an event that took place in space and time. It happened at a particular place, on a particular day, in a particular year. It was attested by witnesses who reported what they heard and what they saw. And if you and I are to grapple with the truth of the Christian gospel and then share in the joy of the Christian hope, we need to reckon with the historical reality of the events that Mark recounts for us here. In an age when there were no digital cameras attached to devices in everyone's pocket, where there were no journalists on hand to observe and then to publish an immediate media record, where the conventions of historical writing were not the same as they might be today, in such a day, history was recorded and verified in a somewhat different manner and by somewhat different means. But Mark is serious. He is serious as an author about showing us that this is real history concerning real events, and so he is giving us a real reason to rejoice. Chapter 15 had ended with the burial of Jesus in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a well-known public figure, a respected member of the council. Verse 43. When Jesus' body was laid in Joseph's tomb and the stone was rolled across the entrance, we are told that there were two key witnesses to this, two eyewitnesses to recount what took place. Chapter 15 and verse 47, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Now, Mark is going out of his way there to be very specific and to be very clear. He wants us to know who it was who saw Jesus' body placed in the tomb. He wants us not simply to know that it was, two followers of Jesus or two women named Mary, but he wants us to know that it was these two women in particular, specifically, women who could be identified, who could be found, who could be asked about it later. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph. Now, Mark usually wouldn't bother with proper names like that in his accounting, but he wants us to register the details. We can imagine him just saying, it was two women called Mary. But no, he wants us to know and be confident that we understand precisely who it is to whom he refers. And notice again how our passage opens and how the resurrection account begins, chapter 16 and verse 1. When the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. The two Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of both James and Joseph, along with Salome, who had been there looking on at the crucifixion, they are now here after the Sabbath to show care and respect for their Lord. They've come to anoint the body of Jesus for burial, which was customary and appropriate. The details that Mark gives us now are specific. They have arrived very early on the first day of the week, verse 2, on the Sunday morning. The sun had risen, but it was still early. Evidently, they had recounted to Mark the flow of the events in close detail, and he records them faithfully for us. As they walk to the tomb, verse 3, they're having a conversation, they're having an exchange, and they remember the substance of it, and Mark writes it down. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb?" It's a good and a very natural question. They had seen the tomb, they had seen the stone, they knew it was too big for them to move. What would they do? They don't have a plan, but they are hoping certainly for the best. Then they arrive at the tomb and they find that the stone had been rolled back. And here again is detail from their visual memory, verse 4, it was very large. They go in and they see a man there, and we've got details again from a visual memory and an account, verse 5. He was a young man and he was sitting on the right side wearing a white robe. And they themselves, they were alarmed by the whole scene. And this young man, he had a specific message for them and some specific words. Really, he had for them the first pronouncement of the good news of the resurrection, the foundational news that changes everything, verse 6. Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Hearing this, they are shaken and they are scared and they run off saying nothing to anyone. Now, it's a detailed account that speaks of eyewitness reporting. And, we can't turn to it and say, why isn't it the kind of report that we would produce now with image capture and voice recording and with a signed affidavit declaring that it's true? No, that's not how it worked 2,000 years ago. No, what we have here in Mark chapter 16, this is how it worked 2,000 years ago and in the ancient world. Provide detail. Name the eyewitnesses. Open it up to verification by them. Now, a skeptic might say, well, you could make all this up. Your so-called eyewitnesses could be in cahoots with you to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. But one of the things that's very interesting and striking about this account is that it is actually not the kind of account that you would make up if you were trying to make up the most credible and believable and impressive story you could. If you were doing that, you would write it differently. You would make it up differently if it was designed as a counterfeit seeking to appear real.
You're listening to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths and a message called A Day of Victory, part of our series, The Darkness Before the Dawn. We're going to pause right here, but stay tuned. We'll get back to the message in just a moment. Probably everyone listening has a friend or a family member, someone who suffers from sickness, disability, depression, maybe even suffering from the death of a loved one around them. And you want to help them. You want to be an encouragement to them. You're kind of wondering what that might look like. Well, Dave Furman can relate. He's written a book entitled Being There, How to Love Those Who Are Hurting. And we'd love to send you a copy of this book as our way of saying thank you for your financial support this month. You can find out more or give online at encounterthetruth.org or when you call 1-833-99-TRUTH. That's 1-833-998-7884 or encounterthetruth.org. Back to the message. Here's Jonathan.
One of the things that's very interesting and striking about this account is that it is actually not the kind of account that you would make up if you were trying to make up the most credible and believable and impressive story you could. If you were doing that, you would write it differently. You would make it up differently if it was designed as a counterfeit seeking to appear real. Consider that. Just think on that with me for a moment, if you would. In the first instance, in this time and place, the author would not have chosen women to be his eyewitnesses. It's not pleasant to reckon with this, but the truth is that in the ancient world, in the Roman world at this time, women were not treated as equals to men. Women were not often afforded the same respect as men. And so if Mark was trying to convince the unconvinced that something was true, and he was kind of devising a crafty way in which to do that, he would surely come up with the names of the most credible men that he could to serve as his counterfeit eyewitnesses. But to name women as the eyewitnesses, well, it's actually totally in keeping with the Lord Jesus and his treatment of women, his counterculturally respectful treatment of women. It makes sense that Jesus would allow 3 women to be the eyewitnesses of the resurrection. But if Mark was trying to do something to convince unconvinced Romans of the story that he has, well, he wouldn't have chosen 3 women to be his eyewitnesses. He wouldn't have set out the story like this. It only makes sense to write the account in this particular way if this is actually what took place. If it is the case that these 3 women witnessed and saw the empty tomb themselves. Now, that's one thing that Mark wouldn't have made up. And I think there's more. I think he wouldn't have made up the fact that 12 disciples, the key followers of Jesus and teachers of his word, the apostles, I think he wouldn't have fabricated an account where they just didn't show up. I mean, think about it. Where they just don't show any care or concern for their Lord on this day of all days. That doesn't look good. It does not present well. And I don't think Mark would have made up the reaction of the women either. You may know, and you'll see it there in your Bible, in your footnote, or at a break in the text, you may know that scholars widely agree that Mark's gospel originally ended here at verse 8. It seems likely that the summary of the events recorded in other gospels, the resurrection appearances of Jesus, weren't actually part of what Mark originally set out for us. The earliest records of the text that we have don't have anything beyond verse 8. And if that's right, if the scholars are right that Mark's gospel actually ends at verse 8, it's a pretty remarkable way to end, isn't it? I don't think I'd end it that way. I can see why some early Christians would have wanted to add on a summary of events that follow. But notice where we're left, verse 8. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. What a finish. What a remarkable way to finish. Now, actually, it's very believable. I can imagine how astounded the women would have been. A man risen from the dead, an angel there to greet them and meet them. It is a remarkable turn of events, isn't it? Stunning, shocking, actually, in a way. And being a little bit overwhelmed by these events, that's not totally surprising, I don't think. But it's also not what anyone would make up as an ideal ending for the gospel. And the fact that all this in the accounting is so raw and is so real. You know, the main disciples have deserted Jesus. The women are there as the eyewitnesses, perhaps not respected as eyewitnesses in their day, but they stick with Jesus. And then when the news of the resurrection comes and they are charged with sharing the good news, they run away confused and frightened. It's not how you or I would write the story. We just wouldn't. But it makes sense as a narrative if this is actually what took place. And Mark is saying to us, in the way in which he recounts this, he's saying to us in essence, I am just telling it to you like it actually was. I am giving you unfiltered reality. And he's doing that for one reason and one reason alone. The events of which he is writing are real history, solid fact, true happenings. When you and I come to the events of Easter, we don't come to fairy tales. We don't come to myths. We don't come to legends that are designed to give us a warm feeling, but that are ultimately empty and meaningless. No, when we come to the events of Easter, we come to real events of history, events that actually took place in time and in space, and events which therefore are filled with substance and significance, even with power. Mark wants to tell us, and he wants to show us, that Jesus really did rise from the dead. This actually happened, and therefore today we are celebrating reality, and we are celebrating truth. This is a day of joy and a day of victory because the resurrection is a historical event. Next, this is a day of joy and of victory because the resurrection is a divine event. As he records the story and recounts the story of this great day for us, Mark wants us to recognize that God himself has stepped into this situation. He has intervened powerfully and has done something very remarkable and very wonderful, something with profoundly far-reaching implications for each one of us here. Now, again, this is another moment where we need to take a little bit of care to shake off the familiarity of Easter, of Resurrection Sunday, and remind ourselves of how truly astounding the resurrection is. Remember, we have here a victory over the grave. We are talking about the defeat of death itself. Death is the great enemy, of course. It is the great unconquerable foe for humanity. In the 2,000 years since Mark wrote his gospel, we have not really made much progress in this great battle against death. With all our science and with all our experience and with all our ingenuity and with all our wealth, all we've really managed to do is to prolong life for some people by a few years. All we've achieved is a brief delay in death for some of the population. But you know, in this world, in this fallen world, age and disease always win in the end. We mortals, we always lose. Death is undefeatable for us. But the message of Resurrection Sunday is that this one man, he did rise miraculously from the grave. And this, friends, this is a miracle. Let's just remind ourselves of that. This is the greatest miraculous intervention by God ever seen or experienced or observed. And of course, God had made it clear beforehand that this is precisely what he would do. The Old Testament promises and prophecies pointed us to it, and Jesus himself had spoken of it clearly. But you know, his followers, they just couldn't process it or make sense of it. They couldn't take that seriously. It was just too much for them to be able to compute. Even these women who had been so loyal to Jesus and who had stayed by him so steadfastly, they hadn't come on this particular day to witness the resurrection. That's not why they were there. Remember what they had come for. They had come to anoint Jesus' body for burial. That was their expectation. The first indication that something extraordinary has taken place here is the fact that the stone covering the entrance to the tomb has been rolled back. The women, as we saw, had been mindful of the fact that this was a logistical challenge for them. They were talking about the stone as they walked over, who would move it, but as they arrive, they see that the stone has been rolled away, verse 4. Looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. Something is up here. Something has happened. Someone has rolled away the stone. There has been an intervention. But now the plot thickens a little bit more. Now things become all the more unusual. Verse 5, and entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. Well, I'm sure they were alarmed. The stone is rolled away. The body of Jesus is gone. A man dressed in a white robe is there, and perhaps they suspect that he was an angel, as we believe he was, a messenger from heaven with words of comfort. Verse 6, and he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Now, literally, the angel actually says, he has been raised. And of course, by saying that, he means that God the Father has raised Jesus. God the Father has intervened here. He has performed a very great miracle. The scene to which these women have arrived, it is a scene of divine intervention, of a very great work of God. If Jesus is alive, then the Father must have raised him. That's the only explanation. And if God the Father has raised Jesus, the implications of that, well, they are immense. If God raised Jesus from the dead, it means that his saving work on the cross has been validated, has been shown to be wholly effective. Just give thought to that for a moment, if you would. If Jesus went to the cross with the stated intention of paying the price of our sin and purchasing our salvation, if he went to the cross, then died and stayed dead, you and I would have absolutely no idea to this day whether his death achieved anything at all. But Jesus went to the cross, yes, with the stated intention of purchasing our salvation, and he went to the cross declaring as well that he would rise again on the third day. And when the Father did indeed raise him from the grave, it proved and it demonstrated that the Father was pleased and the Father was satisfied with his saving work. It proved and it demonstrated that the sacrifice was acceptable, that salvation had been achieved. I've always been quite intrigued by the statement that the Apostle Paul makes in Romans chapter 4 and verse 25, where he says that Jesus was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. That's a very interesting thing to say. But Paul is telling us the raising of Jesus means justification for us who believe. It means that we can have confidence that God the Father has accepted Jesus' sacrifice in our place for our sin, for our wrongdoing, so that we might be made right with the Father, justified in his courtroom, guilty no longer because the price has been paid and payment has been accepted in full.
Jonathan Griffiths here on Encounter the Truth, a message called A Day of Victory. If you'd like to listen to this again, do that at our website, encounterthetruth.org. Well, Encounter the Truth is a listener-supported ministry. We're able to be on this station because of your generosity. And as you give a gift of any amount this month, we want to send you a book that Jonathan has chosen. Jonathan, you picked out Being There, How to Love Those Who Are Hurting. Why did you pick this book?
Well, Steve, we chose this book because we're aware that there will be many listeners to this program who are in a position of trying to support and care for and show love to friends or family or others in their lives who are going through a time of sickness, who are facing disability, who are walking through depression, or who are dealing with grief and loss. And you as a listener, you want to know how to be there, how to help, how to encourage, how to bring the love of Jesus. And learning how to do that and do that well, and learning how to persevere in that, well, that's no easy thing. And you need encouragement from the Word of God, and you need wisdom from others who have walked this road before you. And we believe that this resource by Dave Furman, Being There, will be just that kind of encouragement for you. We're eager to get it into your hands, and we hope it'll be a real blessing in your life.
Well, we'd love to send you this book. Again, it's called Being There, How to Love Those Who Are Hurting, is our way of saying thank you for your financial support this month. You can give online at encounterthetruth.org or when you call 1-833-99-TRUTH. That's encounterthetruth.org or 1-833-998-7884. You can also write us at Encounter the Truth, 2176 Prince of Wales Drive, Ottawa, Ontario, K2E0A1. Or in the U.S. at Encounter the Truth, 215 North Arlington Heights Road, number 102. Arlington Heights, Illinois 60004. For Jonathan Griffiths, I'm Steve Hiller. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us next time.